There are diplomatic decisions that governments present as technical adjustments to trade policy, while actually signaling fundamental realignments in strategic orientation. On January 16, 2026, the Canadian government announced a trade agreement with China that reduced tariffs on electric vehicles in exchange for improved market access for Canadian agricultural products. The announcement was framed as a routine trade negotiation focused on economic benefits for Canadian farmers and consumers seeking affordable electric vehicles. 10 days later, American President Donald Trump threatened to impose 100% tariffs on all Canadian exports if Ottawa proceeded with what he called turning Canada into a drop-off port for Chinese goods entering North America. The gap between how Canada described the agreement and how the United States interpreted it reveals something that most people have not yet recognized. Canada has made a strategic choice to prioritize economic relationships with China over continued subordination to American trade demands. This is not about electric vehicles or canola exports. This is about Canada concluding that its economic future requires diversification away from American market dependence, even if that diversification requires accepting Chinese partnership that Washington views as unacceptable. Most people believe that Canada's relationship with the United States is permanent, built on geography, cultural ties, and shared democratic values that transcend temporary political disagreements. The assumption is that Canadian trade policy will always accommodate American concerns, because Canada has no practical alternative to American market access. That assumption is colliding with a reality that Canadian policymakers recognize months before most observers. American trade policy under Trump has become so unpredictable and so economically damaging that Canada must develop alternatives, regardless of how Washington responds. The January 16 agreement with China was not Canada's first choice. It was a calculated response to 18 months of American tariff threats, trade disruptions, and diplomatic pressure that convinced Canadian officials that relying exclusively on American markets represented an unacceptable vulnerability. The technical details of the Canada-China agreement reveal strategic thinking that extends far beyond the specific products covered. China agreed to reduce tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobster, crab, peas, and other agricultural products that had faced discriminatory duties since 2019. In exchange, Canada agreed to reduce its 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles to levels that would make Chinese EVs competitive in Canadian markets. The agricultural dimension addressed immediate economic pain for Canadian farmers, who had lost access to their largest export market when China imposed retaliatory tariffs during previous trade disputes. Prairie farmers who grow canola, Atlantic fishermen who harvest lobster and crab, and agricultural processors throughout Canada would benefit from restored Chinese market access, worth approximately $2.3 billion annually. The electric vehicle dimension addressed Canada's climate commitments and consumer demand for affordable EVs that domestic production could not supply at competitive prices. Chinese manufacturers produce electric vehicles at costs 30 to 40% below Western competitors due to scale advantages, government subsidies, and integrated battery supply chains. Allowing Chinese EV imports would accelerate Canadian transportation electrification while reducing consumer costs. But the strategic significance transcended these immediate economic benefits. The agreement demonstrated that Canada was willing to engage with China on trade terms that the United States explicitly opposed, that Canadian economic interests would take precedence over American geopolitical preferences, and that China could offer Canadian industries market access that offset losses from American trade disruptions. American officials, who had assumed that tariff threats would force Canadian compliance with American trade demands, discovered that their pressure tactics had produced the opposite result. Rather than making Canada more compliant, American tariffs had made Canada more willing to seek alternatives that reduced dependence on American approval. The Trump administration's response revealed how seriously Washington viewed the Canada-China agreement as a strategic challenge rather than a routine trade arrangement. The threat of 100% tariffs on all Canadian exports was unprecedented in modern Canada-U.S. relations and represented economic warfare rather than trade negotiation. Trump's public statements framed Canada as attempting to circumvent American tariffs by serving as a transshipment point where Chinese goods would enter Canada and then move into American markets through CUSMA provisions that allowed duty-free trade in North American-produced goods. The accusation was that Canada would become China's backdoor into the American economy. Canadian officials responded that the agreement was entirely consistent with CUSMA obligations, that Chinese EVs sold in Canada would not qualify for duty-free access to American markets under rules of origin requirements, and that Canada retained sovereign authority to negotiate trade agreements with other countries, regardless of American preferences. The technical accuracy of the Canadian position missed the strategic point that Washington was making. The United States was not primarily concerned about Chinese vehicles physically entering American markets through Canada. The concern was that Canada was demonstrating willingness to prioritize Chinese trade partnerships over American geopolitical objectives. The symbolism of a major American ally signing trade agreements with China, while the United States was attempting to economically isolate Beijing, sent a message to other countries watching the dispute. If Canada was willing to defy American pressure, then other middle powers might conclude that American trade threats could be resisted rather than accommodated. The timing of the Canada-China agreement reflected careful Canadian strategic calculation. Mark Carney, who became Prime Minister in January 2026 after Justin Trudeau's resignation, brought a perspective shaped by decades in international finance, where he had observed how countries used trade relationships to build leverage and reduce dependence on any single partner. Carney had watched European countries navigate between American and Chinese economic spheres, had seen Asian nations balance competing great power pressures, and had concluded that Canada's historical reliance on American markets represented a strategic vulnerability that Chinese partnership could reduce. His first major trade decision as Prime Minister was to finalize the China agreement that had been negotiated during the transition period between Trudeau's resignation announcement and Carney's assumption of office. The decision signaled that Canada's strategic direction under Carney would prioritize economic sovereignty over continued subordination to American demands. The agricultural dimension of the agreement revealed the political constituencies that Carney was prioritizing. Prairie provinces that grow canola and other grains had been devastated by loss of Chinese market access. Atlantic provinces dependent on seafood exports faced similar economic pressure. These regions had been demanding that Ottawa resolve trade disputes, regardless of geopolitical complications. By restoring Chinese market access, Carney addressed immediate economic pain in regions that would be politically crucial in upcoming elections, while simultaneously reducing Canadian agricultural dependence on American markets that had proven unreliable during trade disputes. The electric vehicle dimension addressed urban voters concerned about climate change and transportation costs. Chinese EVs would provide affordable options for consumers who wanted to electrify their transportation but could not afford the $60,000 to $80,000 price points of Western-manufactured electric vehicles. The climate benefits of accelerated EV adoption would strengthen Canada's position in international climate negotiations. But the strategic calculation extended beyond these immediate political benefits to encompass a longer-term vision of how Canada could position itself in a world where American economic dominance was declining and where China represented an alternative source of market access, investment capital, and technological partnership. Canadian resource industries had observed that Chinese demand for energy, minerals, and agricultural products was growing, while American consumption of Canadian resources was stagnating or declining due to domestic production increases and demand shifts. The future growth markets for Canadian exports were in Asia, not North America. Canadian technology industries had recognized that Chinese investment in artificial intelligence, clean energy, and advanced manufacturing was creating opportunities for partnership that American technology protectionism was foreclosing. Canadian companies could access Chinese markets and Chinese capital if Ottawa was willing to negotiate relationships that Washington opposed. Canadian infrastructure developers had noted that Chinese state-owned enterprises were offering financing terms for ports, transportation systems, and energy projects that Western private investors could not match. Major infrastructure investments that Canadian economic development required could be accelerated through Chinese partnership. The cumulative effect of these sectoral interests created political pressure for Carney to demonstrate that Canada could pursue economic relationships with China regardless of American objections. The January 16 agreement was the visible manifestation of this strategic reorientation. The European response to the Canada-China agreement revealed that other American allies were watching closely to assess whether defying American trade pressure was politically viable. If Canada could negotiate with China without suffering catastrophic economic retaliation from the United States, then European countries facing similar pressures might conclude that they too could prioritize their economic interests over American geopolitical objectives. The European Union had been negotiating its own trade relationship with China while facing American pressure to maintain technology restrictions and investment limitations that would constrain European economic opportunities. EU officials observed that Canada's willingness to proceed with Chinese partnership, despite American threats, suggested that European countries could pursue similar policies. The January 23 announcement of a comprehensive EU-India trade agreement, described by European officials as the mother of all deals, occurred in the context of American trade policy chaos and Canadian demonstration that alternatives to American partnership were viable. The timing was not coincidental. Asian countries that had been attempting to balance between American security partnerships and Chinese economic relationships observed that Canada had effectively chosen economic relationships with China over continued automatic alignment with American trade preferences. This suggested that middle powers could construct foreign policies based on economic interests rather than automatic deference to American geopolitical objectives. The domestic American political reaction to the Canada-China agreement revealed deep divisions within the United States about how to respond to allied countries that were prioritizing economic relationships over geopolitical alignment. Some American officials argued that 100% tariffs on Canadian goods would be economically catastrophic for American industries dependent on Canadian inputs and would drive Canada further toward Chinese partnership. Other American officials insisted that failure to respond forcefully to the Canada-China agreement would signal that American trade threats were not credible and would encourage other countries to similarly defy American demands. The threat had to be executed regardless of economic costs, to demonstrate that American geopolitical objectives took precedence over economic rationality. The internal American debate revealed a fundamental problem with Trump's trade policy approach. Tariff threats were effective tools for extracting short-term concessions, but were counterproductive for maintaining long-term alliance relationships. Countries that faced repeated American tariff threats eventually concluded that diversifying away from American markets was necessary for economic security. The Canadian business community's response to the China agreement was more supportive than Washington anticipated. Canadian exporters who had lost Chinese market access welcomed restored trading relationships. Canadian consumers who wanted affordable electric vehicles supported reducing tariffs on Chinese products. Canadian manufacturers who needed competitively priced inputs recognized that diversifying supply sources reduced dependence on American suppliers who had proven unreliable during trade disputes. The political coalition supporting Chinese partnership was broader and more durable than American officials had expected. This was not a fringe position held by officials who could be pressured into reversal. This represented a mainstream Canadian recognition that economic diversification required relationships with China, regardless of American objections. The infrastructure dimension of Canada-China partnership revealed longer-term strategic implications that extended beyond immediate trade agreements. Chinese state-owned enterprises had been quietly negotiating potential partnerships in Canadian port development, railway expansion, and energy infrastructure that would facilitate increased trade volumes between Canada and Asian markets. The Port of Prince Rupert in British Columbia, which serves as Canada's closest major port to Asian markets, had been expanding capacity to handle increased container traffic between Asia and North America. Chinese shipping companies and terminal operators had expressed interest in partnerships that would integrate Prince Rupert more effectively into Asian supply chains. The proposed investments would not directly involve critical infrastructure the Canadian security agencies had flagged as sensitive, but they would create economic relationships between Chinese enterprises and Canadian transportation networks that would make Canada-Asia trade less dependent on American intermediation. Canadian officials who evaluated these proposals recognized that Chinese infrastructure investment created dependencies that could be exploited for political leverage, as Australia had discovered when China restricted Australian exports during diplomatic disputes. But the officials also recognized that continued exclusive dependence on American markets created vulnerabilities that recent trade disputes had painfully exposed. The strategic judgment was that diversification required accepting some risk of Chinese leverage in exchange for reducing American leverage that had been demonstrated through repeated tariff threats. No relationship would be without dependency risks, but multiple dependencies were preferable to exclusive reliance on an increasingly unreliable American partner. The technology dimension of Canada-China partnership created the most sensitive issues because it involved potential access to advanced technologies that American security agencies viewed as strategically significant. Chinese companies had offered partnerships in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced manufacturing that would provide Canadian technology firms with access to Chinese markets and Chinese capital. American officials had pressured Canada to restrict Chinese investment in technology sectors and to limit Canadian technology exports to China, based on arguments that such partnerships would compromise Western technological advantages. Canadian officials faced difficult choices between accepting American restrictions that would constrain Canadian technology industry growth and pursuing Chinese partnerships that would provide market access but create security complications. The decision framework that emerged prioritized Canadian economic development while accepting security restrictions in the most sensitive domains. Chinese investment would be permitted in commercial technology sectors while being restricted in areas with direct military applications. Canadian technology exports to China would be allowed in civilian applications while being controlled in dual-use technologies. The approach attempted to balance economic opportunities against security risks, but it represented a fundamental rejection of the American position that Canadian technology relationships should be determined by American security preferences rather than Canadian economic interests. The agricultural processing dimension revealed another area where Chinese partnership was reshaping Canadian economic geography. Chinese food processing companies had proposed establishing facilities in Canada that would add value to Canadian agricultural products before export to Asian markets. The investments would create Canadian jobs increase agricultural commodity prices through value-added processing, and reduce Canadian dependence on exporting raw agricultural products to American processors. But they would also give Chinese companies control over portions of Canadian food processing capacity that could be used to pressure Canadian agricultural policies during disputes. Canadian agricultural provinces that had been demanding government action to restore Chinese market access viewed the processing investments as positive developments that would provide stable markets for agricultural production while creating rural employment. The security concerns that worried Ottawa officials were less pressing for prairie communities facing immediate economic challenges. The political dynamics meant that Carney faced constituency pressure to welcome Chinese agricultural investment while facing security agency pressure to restrict Chinese control over Canadian food systems. The tension reflected broader challenges of balancing economic benefits against strategic risks in relationships with countries that were simultaneously partners and potential adversaries. This is not a temporary tactical adjustment that will reverse when American trade policy becomes more predictable. This is a fundamental strategic reorientation driven by Canadian recognition that exclusive dependence on American markets is no longer viable, given American trade policy volatility. The agreements being negotiated, the infrastructure being built, and the business relationships being established will create Canadian-Chinese economic integration that cannot be easily unwound, even if future Canadian governments want to prioritize American relationships. The strategic choice is being locked in through practical arrangements that create vested interests in continued Chinese partnership. There is no announcement declaring that Canada has chosen China over the United States. No diplomatic statement explaining that Canadian strategic orientation has shifted from Atlantic to Pacific focus. There is only the accumulation of trade agreements, investment decisions, and infrastructure projects that gradually redefine where Canadian economic interests lie and which partnerships Canadian governments prioritize. History will record that the reorientation occurred during 2026, when American tariff threats convinced Canadian officials that diversification required accepting Chinese partnerships, despite American objections. But history will also record that most people did not recognize the strategic significance because each individual agreement appeared to be routine trade policy rather than fundamental realignment. And by the time the pattern becomes undeniable, the economic integration between Canada and China will have created dependencies and interests that make reversal practically impossible, regardless of American preferences.